Misconception video, we are going to go over chapter 4, Green Stucco House, and I'm going to address some of the misconceptions you came across as you read, as well as some of the most missed questions. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to jump off by looking at question 1 because it comes from the very beginning of this chapter. Now, number 1 says, in chapter 4, Delphine reflects on the appearance of Cecile's house. What does she realize about her home? Now, I want to point out that there are multiple things that we have to do before we even begin to answer a question. And I want to make sure that we are doing that even though we're at home, even though we're not in our classroom and it's on the computer. When we read a question, we need to think about what is it asking me, find evidence, and then we can use our process of elimination. Then when we narrow it down, ask ourselves, which answer here does my evidence support? All right. So we want to make sure that we're still following that plan of attack for multiple choice questions. So let's go ahead and look. We know that at the beginning of the chapter, it starts off talking about Cecile's house, right? It says, Big Mom said Cecile lived on the street. The park bench was her bed. She lived in a hole in the wall. Now, when she says she lived in a hole in a wall, it's important for us to note that this is what we call an idiom. So an idiom is an expression. It is not fact. We hear these all the time. It's usually a well-known expression that people use to mean something else. So she lived in a hole in the wall. This is what we call an idiom. All right. An expression that is not fact. And the reason why I want to annotate this and I want to write this down is because we know that Big Ma has a certain idea of who Cecile is. We know that she has certain feelings towards Cecile. She is not very fond of her. In the previous chapter, she made it very clear to Pa that she didn't want the girls going there. She talked about how they abandoned her, how they abandoned the kids. And she didn't understand why Pa wanted them to come out to Oakland so badly. So we know that there are some ill feelings towards Cecile. And so I want to mark this up as an idiom because we want to make sure that we understand this is not factual, right? Her living on a park bench is not factual. This was part of her idiom. This is what Big Ma was saying because she just can't understand why she would leave her 3 daughters and run off to Oakland, California. So I just wanted to point that out and then we're going to continue reading. So she goes on to say that when she was 6, so she's talking about, she's going to continue to spend the rest of this page talking about what she imagined her mother living in. She says, your mother lives on the street, a big hole in the wall, sleeping on park benches next to winos. So she talks about when she was 6. So I see this twice. When I was 6, highlight that. All right, when I was 6, and it repeats itself here, when I was 6. Okay, so here when you're 6, so she's making it very clear to the reader that this is what we call, and we've talked about these in the past, we call this a flashback. So a flashback is looking back in time. She's talking about a memory. We know that Delphine is no longer 6 years old. So she keeps referring to herself when you're 6, when you're 6. That is because the author wants to make it very clear to the reader that this is a flashback. She's looking back, right? So again, we're going to compare that with a hole in the wall, parked benches, broken glass to when I'm 6. So she's looking to the past. She's not talking about the present. And then this next chapter talks about she thought it was, she expected her, even though once she got a little bit older, she knew that she didn't literally mean she lives in a hole in the wall. But she expected that she would be bad off. She expected, she wrote it right here, at the very least. That means that she expected, at the very least, it wouldn't be a nice place that they're going to. So I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to come up here and look at number 1. Most people chose D, it was run down and falling apart. Now, this is because you were referring to this one or two things. You did not realize that this was a flashback, okay? Or when you were doing the search for evidence, when we use our plan of attack, you stopped the minute you saw they were talking about what kind of home Cecile lived in. So remember, when we are writing annotations down, one way that we can make sure we don't make that type of mistake is we are making a point to talk about the setting. We are making a point to talk about what's happening. So if I were annotating this part, I would write character, motivation. So Delphine believed that her mother lived in a hole in the wall. The motivation, which is the why, is because Big Ma said these things when she was younger, right? So you want to make sure that you are very clear in your annotations, because if you're not and you go back to review them, you might choose D, because you would see this and you would think, okay, so she lived on the streets. Well, obviously she's poor. And you would make that connection and say that it was run down and falling apart. But we know now that we're looking at this the second time that this is a flashback. So let's move on and let's see, what does her house actually look like? So she says that they arrived. She said, we knew we arrived. She had took off her hat, her scarf, and her dark glasses. So we knew we arrived. Then she goes on to describe what she says. Here's one thing. This is your house? Vanetta was the first to put our amazement into words. Now, amazement, we want to look at that word. Amazement suggests that it's a positive thing. Amazement is that they are impressed. So they're impressed by it. Would they be impressed by a rundown, falling apart home? No, they wouldn't be impressed. In fact, they probably would have not been shocked. They would have just been like, of course, because this is what they grew up hearing about Cecile. So that word amazement makes me think that it can't be run down and fallen apart. Like, they're impressed by this. So even if we're not sure, let's keep going. To begin, the house was covered in peaks of hard green frosting. Stucco, Cecile called it. She said she applied the stucco herself. The green, prickly house was surrounded by a dried out but neatly trimmed yard. So the yard is neat. To one side of the house was a rectangular concrete slab with a roof over it. A carport, she said. So she has a carport. She has a neatly trimmed yard. On the other side, a baby palm tree sloped toward the sun. The palm tree was out of place as the stucco. So something being out of place. So when we refer to something being out of place, it usually means that it doesn't quite belong, right? It doesn't quite belong. Out of place means that it doesn't quite belong. Now, why doesn't it belong? Well, the palm tree is out of place. It doesn't belong because, well, it probably doesn't look like everything else around it. When something's out of place, that's what that means, okay? So now, I could stop here because I think I have enough to answer the question. Now, if I know that it's not because it was run down and falling apart, I can X that out because I know that that part of the text was a memory. Twice as large as the homes around it, it doesn't really mention the size of the home compared to others. So that can't be right. We don't talk about the size of the home. It was different than all the homes in the neighborhood. Well, we have a strong possibility that this would be the answer. All of the homes in the neighborhood were identical. Well, if it was identical, then nothing would be out of place, right? So that can't be right, leaving us with B as our option. So a lot of people chose D as our distractor because they stopped at the very beginning, not realizing that that was a flashback. But our real answer is D, that it stands out of place. It is different. Okay, so most people got number 2 right because it is directly said in the text that she thinks her mother is crazy. At the very end, she says, I know why Cecile left. She's crazy. So we don't need to spend a lot of time there. Most people understood that part. But over here, this third question I want to spend some time on because this is what we call an extreme inference, right? You made an inference, but you didn't base it on the text completely. So, what I mean by extreme inference when I say that is that you used a little bit of the text. So, it would make sense that this would be the answer, but you also took some liberties, right? You know, when we make an inference, we look at the evidence and we take our schema and we put it together and we make an inference. We make an educated guess about what's happening. But for this particular question, you needed to focus on what was happening in the moment, right? What evidence is related to the fight happening on the bed? So, let's look at this question and then we'll go into that a little bit more. So, if we look at this question, it states in chapter 4, Vonetta and Fern get into a fight. What is the unspoken or implicit reason the girls were arguing over the bed? Now, pause here first, and we want to look at those two words, unspoken or implicit, right? Whenever we talk about this, when we see or, and, different words like that, we know that we're going to be given a synonym, and that's what I did here. So unspoken or implicit, it means the same thing. I'm asking you, what is the reason that's not talked about? Why is this argument happening? So you're going to have to make an inference. If it's implicit or unspoken, you're making an inference. Now, I want to point out the answer that everyone chose before we dig deeper. Everyone who got this wrong unanimously picked they were overtired from the flight to Oakland. Now, this is our distractor. So it makes sense that you would choose it because, you know, it kind of works. But there's a better answer. There's an answer that is relevant to the situation at hand, which is them arguing. Now, them being overtired from the flight, that makes sense, right? You think about a long day. If you have a long day, you might be tired too. They were flying all the way from New York City to Oakland, California. They're young girls. They had to then make the journey to Cecile's house. It would make sense that they might be a little bit tired. But I want you to think about when we are looking for evidence to support. Is there any evidence that suggests that the girls are tired? There is not. Okay, so they never mention being tired or cranky. This fight just happens, right? So we need to look at the situation that's going on. Now, they miss Big Ma and Pa. That's not mentioned at all. They do talk about them a lot or refer to them as a lot, but that's mostly because that's who their caretakers are. That's what their memories and all of their experience have been with Big Ma and Pa. So it makes sense that they would refer to them a lot. So we don't think A is the correct choice. But let's move on. We want to go to the part where Cecile starts interacting with the girls, right? Because that's what happens right before they get in this fight in the bedroom. So if we look here, she's telling them where their bedroom is, and we see it says, I could tell Cecile didn't know whether to be annoyed or amused because they didn't understand the term daybed. So we can already tell that she's a little cold, right? She's like, okay, like, whatever, go to your room. All right. She wasn't really into it. She didn't want to explain it to them. She was just like, go to your room. So we already know she's cold, right? We've talked about this in the past. She's not really motherly in the sense of what the quintessential mother is that we discussed previously. So we see here, as usual, Vonetta is trying to tell everyone about herself because we know her personality, her character trait is she's a little bit of a showboat, right? She likes to be the center of attention. So Vonetta is, I'm in 4th grade. Cecile said, I didn't ask for all that. Again, cold, right? She says, I'm going to highlight that and we're going to write that this is a cold comment. C for character. Cecile is cold towards the girls. Cold just means that she's uncaring, right? When we talk about warmth, we're talking about someone who is caring. Cold is the opposite of that. So then Delphine, our narrator who's telling this story, she got her feelings hurt. Really important. Really important. Vanetta's feelings were hurt, right? Cecile didn't care. This hurt her feelings because she enjoys being acknowledged. So let's go ahead and keep going. Vanetta just continues, and this part is just kind of the dialogue of the characters. Remember, this is a very character-driven story, so there is a lot of dialogue that happens here. But then we continue, and Vanetta is kind of, I don't know, outspoken with her words. She just says what's on her mind. She doesn't think about what's going on or Cecile's feelings. She's just kind of like saying things. She's asking where all the stuff is, and Cecile, she finally gets to her melting point, right? She's over it. And she says, I didn't send for you, didn't want you in the first place, should have gone to Mexico to get rid of you when I had the chance. Now imagine being a little girl who meets your mother for the first time. And if we think back to Cassius Clay Clouds, they were talking about all the fun they were going to have when they got to Oakland. And they were kind of daydreaming about what it would be like to meet their mother. And imagine you finally meet your mother for the first time and she says something like this. She didn't even want them in the first place, that she should have gotten rid of them. Like, you don't get rid of people. You don't get rid of children. You get rid of trash. You throw things away. So this makes them feel a certain way, right? They feel a little hurt, maybe even in shock. It was just really cold, and we already know this about her. Definitely not motherly. And we know Vanetta has been planning to seek her approval since the airport. And she's striking out, and that is really hurting Vanetta. And Fern, she is still very, very young. While she might not be reacting the same way outwardly as Vanetta, but she's very young, so she's taking it to heart, right? We can make that kind of inference about her. So let's continue going. They go down and they talk about what the room looks like. And they start to argue, right? He says, I sleep on the top. No, I sleep on the top. And then they start wrestling each other, right? If we continue to read, we can see that they took turns getting the best of each other. Before crying time set in, I pulled one off the other and said, you both sleep on the top. There's enough room. And they have their moment. They continue. And then she asks about Mexico. So all this fighting over the bed. And then when it all finally calms down, they want to know, what do we got to do with Mexico? Why'd she say that? And then, Delphine explains it to her. But this shows us, I want to highlight it for you, that this is something that was bothering them. So yes, they got in a fight. But you ever have something really stressful happening in your life, or maybe you're arguing with a friend or someone said something to make you upset, and then your friend comes up and they want to ask you what's wrong, but you don't want to talk about it, and so you snap on them, right? That's kind of what happened in this situation. They were hurt by the things that Cecile was saying to them and not being embraced and not feeling that affection, that when the smallest thing happened, they flipped on each other, right? And they started fighting. So this was a misconception, okay? So it wasn't because they were tired. It was because they were hurt. They had these expectations of Cecile. And when they finally meet her, she doesn't even show them any kind of decency. Instead, she says, I should have gotten rid of you, sold you to some people in Mexico, right? Because Mexico buys babies, right? So this was hurtful to them. So the implicit or the unspoken reason is that they were hurt by Cecile. And this is strongly, or it's supported in the text, right? Very strongly. Because when we think of strong evidence, right? Remember, it's relevant, it's frequent, and it connects to all parts of the question. So, could they have been tired? Absolutely. But that's not the best answer because it doesn't relate to all parts of the evidence whenever I'm looking at my story. It also doesn't really relate to the girls in the moment, right? That's something, maybe they could be tired, but in the moment, the fight was happening because of something Cecile has said. So those are the main misconceptions that I noticed as I was looking through your texts and your exit tickets. I want you guys to go through and maybe reread this. You can listen to the audio. I'm going to post it for you after this video, and just listen to it again with this in mind, and it might make it a little bit more clear what's happening in this chapter. And this will be really good because tomorrow we're going to be reviewing chapters 1 through 4, just to make sure everyone's caught up, everyone's understanding things, and we can really get to know our characters, because we're going to be moving into some deeper topics and looking at the themes that we've come across so far. So, hope this was helpful to everyone. I hope you have a good night.